Greetings, friends. Wantingruska here. This is the weekly Russian-Ukraine War update for the week of January 12th through January 18th of 2026, and today we're going to begin in the Slavyansk direction. Alrighty, so in the Slavyansk direction, this is where the Russians are picking up pace, and they are making more and more stepping up progress towards Slavyansk. Now, the intermittent goal for this is not just to reach Slavyansk, but to reach the Sovietsky Donetsk-Donbass Canal, which, let me put it up to you, goes something like this. So the main goal for the Russians after they captured Seversk in December was now they're pushing through, trying to reach the town of Alexandrivka, which is the biggest town between Seversk and the canal here. And then after that, my guess is they will also focus on taking the town of Mykolaiivka. This is also a much bigger town, and it also has the Slavyansk power station here. So a big industrial network, has a bunch of high-rise buildings, but it is closer to Slavyansk, so the Ukrainians could support it a more. So it's probably going to be a pretty hard nut to crack, but that is the intermediate goal, and the Russians are slowly but surely reaching this intermediate goal towards Slavyansk, though. Now, what happened? So one of the biggest things that happened this week is that the Russians have completely captured the town of Zakitna, this village right here. We have the Russians raising their flags in this area right here. We also had geolocation of the Russians being bombed in this area of Zakitna. Now, the biggest question is about these hills here. There's no buildings here, but it is more on the higher elevation. It's a bit of more on a hill here. So it's a question of, have the Russians captured this hill to the south of Zakitna yet? And Russian sources are saying they have taken it, but Ukrainian sources are saying they're using counterattacks and trying to dislodge the Russians, or are counterattacking, trying to take these hills. Because taking Zakitna, yes, it's good to take it, but also, more importantly, is to take this hill here. So Zakitna just fell like a day ago, so we still need some clarifications on what exactly is which. But if the Russians have taken this hill, then they're in a very good position here. So, yeah, it's taking Zakitna, a very good goal for the Russians. This also helps them probably take the rest of Voronezh. And so the Ukrainians are falling back to the towns of Krylovka and Kalinovka if they aren't able to dislodge the Russians from Zakitna. And so this is where the next Ukrainian defense line is, Krylovka and Kalinovka. I don't even think Kalinovka even is a village. Okay, there's like some warehouses. Okay, there's like some buildings here. But in any case, Krylovka is the more bigger goal here, has and everything. So this is the next place the Russians will be focusing on. And yeah, so Zakitna falling is just another big step for the Russians. Another big thing the Russians have done, we had, most sources are now saying the Russians are now battling for the long village of Dnipropetrovsk here. This is actually a pretty decent-sized town, especially in this kind of more open field area. A lot of these villages, as you can see, are very sparsely populated. Dnipropetrovsk is a pretty decent-sized town, and will allow the Russians to accumulate forces here. And according to most sources, that the Russians have entered the most southern part of Dnipropetrovsk, these kind of building right in the very southern part. And the Russians are now just going to slowly but surely take building by building, going up this village here. And, there's not really much the Ukrainians could do. The Ukrainians will have to use Alexandrivka to, send troops through these fields, or they're going to have to move them through these fields here. But as you can see, there's a lot of space between where the Ukrainians could accumulate assault forces and Dnipropetrovsk. So it's a bit of a if the Ukrainians lose this, then this is a very good starting off point to start encircling Alexandrivka from the south here. So the Russians have entered the southern part of it after taking Bogdanovka last week, I should say. So another step for the Russians here. A lot of sources are now saying they're also now battling, trying to take this ravine, this kind of more ravine or tree line right here. So the Russians are now just kind of pushing slowly but surely out from this way. The Russians are also pushing across Rizanivka. Rizanivka is a very long village. It goes like all the way here, so it's a pretty long one. So the Russians have captured about 30%, about a third of it. But the more important part is the Russians have captured these hills that are to the north of it. And so with the Russians also pushing in the south here, they're taking the more higher elevation and also taking the trench networks, which is actually what's important. So if they continue doing that Rizanivka will fall very soon. So, yeah, so the Russians are making step-by-step progress towards Slavyansk. Another big thing is one of the most important parts is this group of villages that were kind of one of the main defenses for the southern part of the Slavyansk direction, Makivka, Glubivka, and Perliovka. Most sources are saying that the town of Makivka has completely fallen to Russian forces. As you can see, it's a pretty big village here, and taking it is a very good gain for the Russians. Along with this, the pro-Russian sources, specifically the Ministry of Defense, has announced that they've taken the village of Perliovka here. Now, Glubovka is the only village that's not been claimed by the Russians, but again, Glubovka is like a one-way street village, very small. So if they have not claimed it, I have no doubts that by the end of next week they will claim it. We just need more geolocation of the Russians being in Perliovka. We had I think there was a geolocation of at least one of the Russians being here, but I'm not certain. I forgot. But in any case, it does seem like the Russians are active in this area. This is where the Ukrainians had a lot of defenses here, and this will, if the Russians are able to actually capture this and kind of go along the canal here, it would be this would also break the southern defenses of the Slavyansk direction. That being said, I do not think the Russians are going to continue pushing towards Kramatorsk or Slavyansk. So, because there's a huge amount of defenses here, and I think the Russians will reach the canal here, but then they'll just use this canal to be able to send drones and artillery to bomb Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. I don't think there'll be a direct assault. I think they're going to try to wait for the Russians to maybe do a bit more of an encirclement here, but who knows? A lot of times, I've always thought the Russians would do an encirclement and instead they do a direct attack. So, who knows? I don't have the Russian playbook here, but that's what I would do. But at the very least, they have to reach the canal at the first before they even think about starting to move towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. But yeah, taking Makivka, maybe taking Perliovka is another, again, big goal for the Russians, or not goal, they did that, another big gain for the Russians. So as you can see in the Slavyansk direction, that's why I named this video about the Russians are picking up the offensive here. It's getting more and more difficult for the Ukrainians in this direction. So if the Russians could, right now what the Russians are going to do is probably clear up this area right here, clear up Nikiforivka, and kind of have something like this. And this would help their southern defense here. It might take maybe the rest of January to accomplish this, but they will eventually do that. Along with this, they're going to try to reach Kurulivka and Kalinivka. They will probably be able to do this by the end of January as well. Probably have something like this. So by the end of the month, this is probably what the Russian goal is. And to reach the outskirts of Alexandrivka and start, bombing it and start the actions to take this town in February sometime. So that is the goal for the Russians at the moment. And then obviously they'll try to take Alexandrivka and then use this as a base towards Mykolivka here. So that is the goal for the Russians for the winter campaign of 2026. And it just depends on how long it will take for them to do that. Maybe it takes them a long while. Again, this is a lot of these villages are small. There's not very much areas to hide. And with drones, it's actually, you actually want like a pretty big size town to hide in, because that allows you to hold to accumulate forces. This is why taking Severus was a very good game. That's actually why the Russians are able to push a lot further. But the further they go westward, there's more of a supply issue, and the Ukrainians have Slavyansk, they have Mykolivka, which will protect their supplies, or allow them to accumulate forces, do counterattacks, and hide drone operators and such. So a lot of good gains for the Russians in the Slavyansk direction, and we shall see how that develops. Another place now we're going to go to where the Russians are also making progress is in the Kostyantynivka direction. In this area, the Russians are making a lot of progress in the southern part of Kostyantynivka, and making a lot of good progress. The biggest news is that the Russians have completely cleared the entire northern part of the Klibenbalka Reservoir, clearing up everything here. They also cleared all these trenches that are to the north of Yelolubovka, and what was this area called again? Alexandra Helenovo. So these trenches that are to the north, and this area to the north of Klibenbalka Reservoir has been taken. We talked about the Russians took this major stronghold in this roundabout here. This is on a hill. So if Russians could accumulate forces here, this gives them the height advantage. Along with this, we had even pro-Ukrainian sources are saying the Russians did like a big attack and entered Ilinivka. Not just this week, but I think this happened sometime earlier in January. And now the entire town of Ilinivka is in a gray zone. And the Russians have an accumulated force are not secured here, but it's also not. There's also not Ukrainians aren't like still in full secure of Ilinivka. So It's we had another geolocation in not in Ilinivka, but like kind of in this like area right in this forest right here of the Russians being bombed. So so the Russians were moving here and then getting bombed. So it does show that if they're moving here, then that means there's probably some Russian position in Ilinivka. We don't have any geolocation or any to get an idea of like what is the front line here, who controls what. But if the Russians are able to secure Ilinivka, that would be a very bad day for the Ukrainians. Um, I have no right now. Berostok is still under Ukrainian control, but I have no doubts that the Russian will probably try to storm this town very soon, probably sometime next week. By the next update, I'll talk about probably the fall of Berostok, even, or at least the battle for Berostok. So yeah, Berostok, Ilyinivka, Stepanovka. We had geolocation of the Russians being on the outskirts of Stepanovka, but not in Stepanovka. So I'm kind of surprised they haven't taken this yet. Ilyinivka is kind of out of the way. I don't know how they were able to break into Ilyinivka, but not Stepanovka or Berostok. Maybe like the Ukrainians knew they were going to attack Berostok and Stepanovka, so had more forces here, and Ilyinivka was less defended, so they're able to break through here. So yeah, this kind of small breakthrough for the Russians, Ilyinivka, is a very bad news for the Ukrainians. So it just depends on what happens. But yeah, I do suppose that the Russians will try to take Stepanovka and Berostok very soon. And I wouldn't be surprised that by the end of January they take Berostok and Stepanovka, and then use this to continue pushing forward and try to actually secure Ilyinivka and Dovobalka as well. So this is kind of starting to outflank Konstantinivka from the west now. So not just from the south, but also from the west here. Now, a bit more to the east of Konstantinivka, we had more, again, this map is not updated yet, but we've had geolocation basically confirming that the Russians are basically, everything underneath this highway is under Russian control. Now, we had another, so this kind of like south, eastern part of Konstantinivka is under Russian control, and this is where the Russians are accumulating forces. Now, this area right here near Protishina has a ton of trench networks. These trenches were built up because they were expecting a direct assault from Chasiv Yar towards Konstantinivka from here, and so there was a bunch of trenches right here. And so the Russians took them, but also since the Ukrainians are still like on, they haven't pushed out of Chasiv Yar. The Ukrainians are able to accumulate forces in these like villages here, which have a bunch of trenches and strongholds, and then do counterattacks repeatedly and try to enter Protishina. So there's a bunch of back and forth here. So the Russians are really trying to hold on to their positions in these trenches here. But again, there's like nothing here. There's just trenches. There's no like housing really. I'm pretty certain that all the housing has been blown up. So it's just a matter of if the Russians could hold on here. So I do think that the Russians have to continue move developing Konstantinivka from the north. This is where they kind of stopped. We talked about how the Russians have taken over Markova. We talked about how the Russians are entering Markova, but we had no confirmation if they've taken it yet, but they probably will take it by the end of next week. In any case, we also talked about how the Russians might have taken Verolubovka, but the Ukrainians did a counterattack and retook it, or at least that's what the Ukrainians claim. So yeah, I do expect that the Russians trying to secure their positions along this railway right here, and then at that point try to push southwards along with pushing through here and try to take a bunch of these villages that are right here. Because if they can take these villages, then this will allow them to envelop Konstantinivka from the north as well. Just as I mentioned, they're trying to envelop it from the south. So a lot of good gains for the Russians in Konstantinivka, at least in the south here, and I do expect that Konstantinivka will be a very big focal point for the beginning of for this first half of 2026. So we shall see how that develops. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Dobropillya direction. There's been not really that much changes in the Dobropillya direction, just some more clarifications. The biggest clarifications is in the northern part of Pokrovsk here, is that we had multiple geolocations of the Russians being in these warehouses that are to the north of Pokrovsk here. And so yeah, this shows that these like warehouses in the north of Pokrovsk are under Russian control, so that's very good for the Russians. It shows that there is no Ukraine. The Ukrainians are claiming they're still in control of northern Pokrovsk, but that is not the case. We've had ever since 2026. I don't think we've had any geolocations coming out of Grishny. Like, are the Russians still in this southern part here? I do think they probably are if they're able to hold on to these warehouses. But in any case, if they're still holding on to here, they have not expanded out there. But I do think the Russians will try to take Grishny. It's a very good, to protect their flank here. Russian sources are saying they've kicked the Ukrainians out of Radinsky and have reasserted control over Radinsky, but we don't have a geolocation of that. So right now, it's still claimed that it's still being contested. I could see either or, but I have no data to claim either way. So with the absence of data, we'll probably still say that it's still being contested, but it's just something to keep in mind that what Russians are saying. The northern flank is where the Russians have made the most progress in 2026 so far. But this week there's not been that much changes. We talked about how the Russians kind of took Novoshakhov and Ivanovka last week and are kind of along this like flank here is a bit more secure. We talked about how the Russians kind of reached these like water stuff here, these kind of like small little areas here, and are protecting the northern flank of Shakova and such. And yeah, we shall see how that develops. And if the Russians continue improving on their offensive here, it's going to bloom in multiple directions. The biggest thing is, they're going to move along this rail line towards Nova Donbass, to the north towards Kuchov Yar, and then towards the east toward Toretska here. If they could take something like this, then again, this protects their flank. The thing about before, when the Russians did their Dobropillya breakthrough towards Zoltoye Kolodasky, is that they weren't in control of their flanks here, and they were continuously attacked on the flanks. Now, if the Russians take Toretska and Novodonbaska, then they'll be able to control Kuchov Yar a lot more better, and then from there, the Russian. Let me see. Is this a rail line as well? I'm not sure. Or is this just a road? Any case, if they do this, then they could then move towards Zoltoye Kolodasky, Vasola, Grushki here, and start enveloping Dobropillya from the east here. Once they do that, they'll probably also try to storm these areas to the south of Dobropillya. But again, right now the Russians are very slowly but surely doing this. It's very step by step. Dobropillya is probably on the Russian agenda for 2026. And we should just see. But right now they have to do the steps to envelop it before they can start battling for it. So right now, a lot of progress in the north here. It looks like the southern part is being more and more secure for the Russians, but again, the progress is not as much. But yeah, that's really it in the Dobropillya area. I kind of add this area right here near Ivanovka, Novopalovka as part of the Dobropillya area. We talked about how the Russians took all these fields around Novopalovka, and we still need more geolocation to know what exactly is happening in Novopalovka. We had some in November where we had the Russians basically breaking into Novopalovka, but then they said they got kicked out. So we don't know exactly what's going on in Novopalovka. My guess is that the Russians are trying to clear everything to the south of the river here, at the very least. Because if they could clear that, then they could have the river as a defense, and the Ukrainians could also defend themselves on the northern part, and then there'll be kind of a bit of a stable peace, quote unquote. But we still don't know what exactly is happening in Novopalovka. But what we do have some geolocation of is that the Russians are basically in control of Ivanovka. We had geolocation of the Russians being in this part of Ivanovka right here. So this map hasn't updated that this part of Ivanovka has been retaken by the Russians, because they're like, okay, only this. But if the Russians are being in this eastern part here, it's pretty good certain that the Russians are still in control of the central part of Ivanovka. That being said, if the Ukrainians can do counterattacks to enter Ivanovka, so it's a very precarious bridgehead against on the other side of the river. To supply it, they have to cross the river. Now there could be drone drops and all that, but it's very much a hard situation for the Russians in this area here. Not hard, but just it's more. The Ukrainians can make their lives a hard timer. But these geolocations show that despite what Ukrainians claim that they kicked the Russians out of Ivanovka, the Russians are still here. So it looks like Ivanovka is still under Russian control, and Novopalovka is still being contested. But yeah, so it looks like these two towns are slowly but surely coming under Russian orbit, but they still need to be secured a bit better. But yeah, that's the Dobropillya area. Now we're going to go to the Dnipropetrovsk / Zaporizhia direction. There's been some small changes here as well. In the kind of in this northern part, there's actually not been that much changes, but we're in this kind of near Glyopolya, there's been some changes. So the biggest changes is that the Russians have completely captured the towns of Prilukovka and Alexandro. Wow, this name is fucking long as fuck. Anyway, we had geolocation of the Russians raising their flags in these two villages here. Now, the important part is not necessarily these two villages, it's the trench network. Again, these villages fall along the Ukrainian defense line here. And it's not just the village, it's taking the strongholds, the trenches that are along Prilukovka and how Alexandro fucking this fucking Greek-ass, long-ass name here. Anyway, Taking these two down basically just means they are having a more and more solid bridgehead on the other side of the river here, taking more and more of the defenses here. Now, the thing is, the Ukrainians are doing counterattacks. We talked about this last week, how the Ukrainians were doing a counterattack to try to dislodge the Russians from Prylyvka, and they're able to do that because they have a lot of big village towns here to accumulate forces. They have the towns of Kostyantynivka here, Ryzhdanovka, Ternavata, and such, Zaporizhia. So if you kind of scroll down here, as you can see, these are very big towns, relatively speaking. And, so they could accumulate a lot of forces here, and the towns that are along the river here are pretty small. As you can see, Prylyvka is just like a one-way street village along this. And so, and along with this, the Russians have to actually put their, again, like Ivanovka, they have to use the river to ferry their troops across. So with that being said, it's not ferry, but just it's a bit of a barrier for supply. In any case, it does look like the Russians have, they have a bridgehead in the north here, they have a bridge in the south, so they're making some small progress. But again, it's very precarious. And the biggest thing the Russians are trying to do at the moment is probably take the town of Ternavata. Taking Ternavata will then allow the Russians to have a big village or big town to accumulate forces, and then their bridge will be a lot more stable. But till that point, it's a bit. The Ukrainians could continue doing their counterattacks. The only thing probably stopping them is that their manpower situation in the Zaporizhia direction is not as good as it is in other directions. So doing counterattacks is not as they're not able to do it as much as they would like. Now, a bit more to the south here, we had more and more. We talked about the fall of Zilenia happened last week. We had more and more sources are saying that the Russians are about to take the town of Svetopetrivka here, and the battle. We had geolocation of the Russians being in this special education school. It's kind of interesting, like who, like is this just for Dobropillya? Like they're like, okay, if you're retarded, we're taking you here. It's interesting. It seems kind of quaint though, like right, you just kind of get dropped off here. It's like a bit of a or when they say special education school, do they mean like this is for like smart people? Anyway, this looks very quaint though. Very quaint. Anyway, it looks like though we had the Russians being in the special education school, and I wouldn't be surprised if they take Svetopetrivka very soon. Most sources are saying that the Russians are about to take it. And if they take Svetopetrivka, they're probably going to continue pushing towards this rail line here. Try to take Kicherinovka, Staro Ukrainka here. And this will actually cut off Zaporizhia from the north here. And then once they do that, then I think the Russians will probably start once they reach this rail line right here. And, kind of like something like this going on. Then they'll be able to attack Zaporizhia on multiple angles and then take Zaporizhia as well, which will be another big area the Russians could accumulate forces with to continue pushing, probably in two directions. I always thought they'll probably just continue pushing north along this rail line, try to take Versiska Tereska here, and just, break through in this direction. But I think they'll also try to just continue pushing north, or pushing west along this bunch of these trenches here. And the main goal here is to reach the town of Amulet, which will then cut the main supply route to Orekov here. So, we shall see how that develops. Now, a bit more in like what we traditionally call the Zaporizhia directions. Actually, where the Russians are making a lot of this is where the big progress is happening this year as well. And the biggest thing is that we talked about how the Russians had basically taken the entire town of Primorska. We actually had another geolocation of the Russians being in this area right here. So it's only basically this northern part that's only mappers have taken, but even neutral mappers are saying this northern part has been taken. Now, the Russian Ministry of Defense is not, I don't think that's confirmed Primorska has been captured, but so there's probably still clashes here, but we shall, most mappers are saying this northern part is under Russian control. So Primorska has fallen pretty much. The town of leukemia has fallen. Now this is actually where the biggest. So in this area, this is the high ground. This high ground this high ground of these villages right here is kind of one of the main after the fall of Stephanovsk is where the Ukrainians have fallen back to, because if the Ukrainians lose these villages, they will be on the low ground because it's on the river here, and the Russians will be able to use this to move towards the town of Yurivka here, and taking Yurivka will basically allow the Russians to then cut the road this east between Zaporizhia and Orekov here, just as the Russian push here towards Amulet will allow to cut the northern route here. So as you can see, there's a beginning of a giant encirclement of Orekov here, and we shall see how that develops. But again, these two areas, the main goal here again is to push towards this highway here, and then the purpose here is to push towards this highway here. And so once they cut this, then they'll be able to start encircling Orekov and take it. And taking Orekov will be a very good gain for the Russians here to continue pushing towards Zaporizhia city. Now, in terms of this, Leukemia has fallen, and a lot of the Russian Ministry of Defense said they have captured this town, a town of Novobulovsky here, which makes sense. I guess it's not really that much of a big village. I don't think, yeah, there's like one or two buildings here, so I do see why they claimed that. Maybe they sent some soldiers here and then they took it. That being said, the main kind of jewel of the crown is Nova Yanilovka here. As you can see, there's a pretty decent-sized town, and sources are saying the Russians have broken into the southern part here, have captured kind of this part right here, and so they're now battling for this town here, so we shall see how that develops. A lot of sources are saying they reached the town of Pavlovka and have taken the eastern part here, so the battle for this town is also ongoing. The only town where the Ukrainians are still in full control is Mala-Dolinivka, but I'm pretty certain that the Russians will enter that very soon. We also had geolocation of the Russians being to the north of Stepanhursk, at least in these tree lines to the north here, so it does show that Stepanhursk is under full Russian control. Along with this, we actually had this come out today and on Sunday, is that the Russians are actually still in full control of Mala-Sherbriki and Sherbriki. We had geolocation of the Russians being in these tree lines right here. So it does show that Mala-Sherbriki and Sherbriki are under full Russian control. Before, when the Russians were still stuck in Kupyansk and they were pushing towards these villages, the Ukrainians still had Stepanhursk. They still had all these villages in the north here, so they were able to do counterattacks and enter these villages. And so it was very epic. But now that the Ukrainians are on the back foot and the Russians are taking these villages, it's now the Russians are able to probably still be in more control of this area. So the main goal for the Russians here is to take these sets of villages here and then have the front line go somewhere like this. And then from here, the Russians will move towards Yurivka, probably move along this canal here towards Rechny and Vasilivka, and then also probably try to take the town of Novoandrivka as well. And, that'll be the main goal. So we shall see how the Russians develop this kind of Zaporizhia direction here. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Lyman direction. Some small changes here. The biggest thing, I mentioned this earlier when I began this video, that now we had 100% geolocation of the Russians being in Dobrova. We had the Russians being in the southern part of Dobrova, so it does show that Dobrova is under Russian control. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that they've taken Dobrova, so I do think Dobrova is under Russian control. Along with this, we had geolocation of the Russians being in Orozhina. However, we don't have geolocation of the Russians being in the southern part of Orozhina. And surprisingly enough, the Russian MOD has not claimed this. So maybe there's still fighting going on, but with the fall of Zakhytna, and if the Russians are able to actually secure these hills specifically, I do think that the Ukrainians won't be able to hold on to Orozhina. So we shall see how that develops. I want to claim that Orozhina has been taken because, we have the Russians being in the... the Russians are... Oh, sorry. Man, dude, I slept for like 24, literally for hours. Like on Saturday, I was just a sleepy bear. But in any case, I'm still tired for some reason. It's kind of weird, like when you sleep a lot, you're still tired. In any case, Orozhina is still under, not under, it still is contested. So I do think it's under Russian control, but we need more confirmation. But we do know the Russians are at least in the northern part of Orozhina, and they completed Dobrova. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians are in Orozhina. They're just maybe consolidating and before they claim it. But in any case, yeah, the falls of Kitna, Orozhina, Dobrova basically seals the fate of the southern part of Lyman. Now, in the northern part of Lyman, there's a lot of interesting things happening here. We talked about how the Russians were in Sonsovka, in Stepanhursk. Now, this mapper says they got kicked out of here. It makes sense. They probably were DRGs. But the one thing that I think has changed is that they've claimed that the town of Yarova is in the gray zone. Now, pro-Russian sources are saying that the town of Yarova has been captured. Now, again, the Russian Ministry of Defense has not claimed this. But again, we had geolocation of the Russians being in this western part of Yarova, and we had geolocation of Russia being in the southern part of Yarova. There's nothing in the center part of Yarova, but if the Russians are in the flanks here, I don't think there's really any Ukrainian position, or at least it's very precarious if the Ukrainians are still in the center. But in any case, I do think Yarova probably has been taken by the Russians. Again, we need more confirmation. But again, if Yarova has fallen, that basically cuts off one of the main supply routes to Lyman from the north, and this will allow them to start storming Dobropillya, which is still holding somehow. So, but yeah, Yarova falling is a very good gain for, basically falling is a big gain for the Russians. and we shall see how that. As you can see, I do think Lyman will be probably the first big town to fall in 2026. So yeah, the encirclement of Lyman, with the fall of basically Yarva, Orezhina, Dobrova, again, it's getting more and more squeezed. Now, a place where when we talk about Lyman, we talk about Lyman itself, but in a bit more in this northern part, we've actually had more changes here. The biggest change is we actually had geolocation of the Russians having reconquered the town of Rekadup. We talked about in the beginning of fall into summer how the Russians took Rekadup, and then the Ukrainians did a counterattack and restored control over about half the village. And after that happened, we had no more geolocations, we had no more changes happening in Rekadup. We basically were in this limbo state where Rekadup was only halfway captured between Russians and Ukrainians for all of the fall and winter of 2025. But this week we had geolocation of the Russians being in the western part. So it does show that Rekadup finally is under Russian control. And Russians are saying, as you can see, there's this river that kind of cuts Kharkov in half. It's that the eastern part of Kharkov, this area right here, is also under Russian control. And only the western half is under Ukrainian control, just because there's a river that separates it. So, lots of good gains. If the Russians are in full control of Rekadup, this secures the northern flank a lot more securely. So it does allow them to attack this a lot. Because if the Ukrainians were able to retake Rekadup, they would be able to use this to continue pushing towards the town of Novi. And if they were able to break into Novi, this would have been very bad news for the Russians, because Novi and Rekadup were kind of like the northern defense here. And if they fell, then this entire area here, is going to be very compromised. So it's very precarious. That's probably why the offensive in Lyman is very slow, because there's not really a big town close by the Russians could push towards. It's just a bunch of open fields, and all these villages have been razed to the ground because they've been fought over for months now. So it's very hard to just continue, especially under drone cover or fire, to advance towards Lyman. So we shall see how that develops here. But yeah, Rekadup falling is a very good game for the Russians in their defense here. Alrighty, now we're going to go towards the Kupyansk direction. There's not been that much changes in the Kupyansk direction, actually. Again, but a lot of clashes, but I don't think there's not really been any map changes. There's been some clarifications, like we had the Ukrainians are in the northern part of Kupyansk in this area right here, so it does show that they're in the northern part here. It's very mixed. This is probably one of the biggest areas where there's a lot of mixing going on. Right now the Russians are in control of Pokrovsk and Leningrad, and there's probably less and less Ukrainians there able to infiltrate. But Kupyansk is now the center of where this kind of area where there's intermixing of all these like forward positions. There's not like a very solid front line. Kupyansk is basically a giant gray zone, and you could claim each side, the Russians are still claiming they control all of Kupyansk. That is complete BS. The Ukrainians are saying they kicked the Russians completely out. That actually is a bit more. I actually do believe the Ukrainians a bit more than the Russians. That being said, I only believe that for the western part. Again, Kupyansk is divided in half by the Oska River, and then everything on the western part of Kupyansk, I could actually see the Ukrainians being mostly in control of all that. But again, there's this eastern part of Kupyansk, this area right here, where it's very hard for the Ukrainians to kick the Russians out, because again they will have to cross the river, and then now their supply is very much more in jeopardy, and it's a lot easier for the Russians to supply this eastern part. So this eastern part is still under Russian control, but this western part is very much precarious. But that being said, I'm not going to claim it's completely under Ukrainian control, because we had a geolocation last week of the Russians being in Moskovka right here. So and even most mappers, even neutral mappers, are saying there's still Russian presence, at least in this kind of like center northern part of Kupyansk. So there's still a lot of back and forths. And now we also, last week we talked about how we had geolocation of the Russians raising their flags in Krylyvka and Polonia. Again, we don't know if that was DRG activity. We don't know if that was just them raising their flags and leaving. But I do think that they should at least put this entire area in the gray zone. I don't think there's no Ukrainian positions here, especially since the Russians are able to push through here. But I do think Polonia and Krylyvka are more, maybe this was just DRG activity. We need more confirmation. Again, there's something in the Oska River that makes the Russians retarded here. So I have no doubts that the Russian, commanders here probably sent troops here to raise their flags to claim they control this and then left. I don't think there's very full control here, just as they did in Petropavlovka. So we still maybe it's not. Maybe they are in control of Polonia and Krylyvka. If that's the case, then their positions in the eastern part of this Kupyansk direction are a lot more secure. but we still need more geolocations. And my main guess is the Russians are going to try. If I was the Russian commander here, I'd focus mostly on trying to clear this eastern bank here. Try to clear the eastern part of Kupyansk, take Polonivka, Kurlyivka, Petropavlovka, and from there, then they'll be able to start advancing towards the main Ukraine position on the eastern bank, which is Kupyansk, Volsolonia here. But yeah, it's a very big fluid gray zone. The positions are intermixed. It's very much a big clusterfuck. Along with this, in the south here, we know the Ukrainians are still in control of Bukoslavka, Novopavlovka. Again, the Russians claimed to capture this, but this was banana. That is not true. However, we did have one geolocation proving that the Russians have taken these trenches that are to the east of Novokrolovka. But again, there's a bunch of trenches here. You can see a trench network here, a trench network here. So there's a bunch of trenches here, and the Russians have taken some of these trenches, but not all of them. So some clarification that the Russians have taken some trenches near Novokrolovka, but not the town itself. So we shall see. So a little bit of a good gain for the Russians, but again, it shows that they have not taken this entire northern part of Borova as they claim. So again, bit of a jumping the shark from the Russians in this western area. And then in the Kharkov area as well, kind of the same thing. Not been that much changes. The biggest thing is the Russians have captured this like forest between Perliivka and Lyman, and they're now reaching the towns of Kharkov and Slavyansk. Actually, I had when I was looking at my Telegram before I made this video, there was a Russian source, just one Russian source though, that was claiming that the Russians have entered Slavyansk and Kharkov, and the battles for these two villages are ongoing. Maybe this started happening today, and people are still getting updates on that. So maybe by the end of next week, I'll say like, hey, the battle for Kharkov and Slavyansk is now ongoing. Maybe they'll be able to capture it. Maybe they're able to capture these two villages. But yeah, I do see these two villages being captured soon. So, but we don't know exactly what's happening. Maybe that but we do know that this kind of field to the north of Kharkov has been taken by the Russians. Along with this, the Russians are also battling here Volchanska Kutoroya, and even this mapper has claimed that the center part of Volchanska Kutoroya has been captured by the Russians, and only the most eastern part is left. So we shall see how that. We'll have no geolocation of that. We had geolocation of the Russians being in the western part of Volchansk finally. Again, when they announced they took Volchansk, they didn't raise their flag in the most eastern part here, but we had geolocation of the Russians being bombed here. So it does show that they're at least in this area here. But this area in Volchansk and Kutoroya, we don't have any geolocations yet. So it's just mappers saying with their sources and such. So we shall see how that develops. Well, at least according to a lot of neutral and pro-Russian mappers, is that the town of Volchansk and Kutoroya is about to fall to the Russians, and just the eastern part is left. But we shall see. We need more clarification of what's happening there. And then, lastly, in the Sumy direction, there's not been that much changes. They made a small bridgehead here and then stopped. They retook Andriivka and Oleksivka, but then stopped. Now, the biggest change here is that they made another opening here, and they have captured the town of Komarnovka here, this town right here. As you can see, it's across the river, and they took this town right here. Now, apparently there was a lot of clashes here, and it took a while for the Russians to take it. So it does show that the Ukrainians here had some defenses here. But besides that, we had the Russians raising their flags in Komarnovka here. So, but I don't, maybe that was just a one-way, where they just attack once and then stop. Maybe it's just I don't think there's going to be any expansion of the front here. We shall see. Maybe the Russians are trying to, because this area of Sumy is surrounded by Russian positions, they're able to maybe attack from Russian positions here and from Russian positions here, and then maybe capture this part of Sumy. That will flatten the front line and take a decent chunk of Sumy Oblast from the Ukrainians. The main goal here is, if they manage to make a big deal here, is to take the town of Globovka here. But maybe this is just just like these other incursions into the border town. Maybe this is all that happens. So we shall see how that develops. But it's another area the Russians have entered in the Sumy direction. Alrighty, that is the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this weekly Russian-Ukrainian update. There's also been a bunch of major attacks on the power infrastructure of Ukraine, and there's a lot of the winter is here. That's probably why there's a lot of slow movement on the ground. But along with this is also turning off the lights in a lot of areas of Ukraine. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy this video. Be sure to subscribe to my channel to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian updates. Like this video, comment your thoughts, share this video around, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day. So aim high. and wander on.